In the dust-choked town of Redemption Peak, a place where secrets were currency and judgment was swift, a lone cowgirl, branded an outcast by her own kin, found refuge in the unlikely warmth of a horse stable. They called her a disgrace, a ghost haunting the sprawling ranch that should have been her birthright. Every night, the scent of hay and horsehide was her only comfort. That is until the town's coldest heart, Sheriff Brody, a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape, found her. What he did next would shatter the fragile peace of the town and unearth a scandal buried for decades, proving that sometimes the deepest rifts can only be healed by the most unlikely alliances. The dust of redemption. Peak Montana settled on everything, a fine, gritty powder that coated the soul as much as it did the windowsills. For 24-year-old Cassidy Cass Ray Thompson, it was the taste of her exile. Each morning she awoke not to the familiar creak of floorboards in the sprawling ranch house she once called home, but to the gentle nicker of a stallion named Midnight, his breath a warm cloud in the crisp dawn air of the stable. The T-Cross Ranch, her family's legacy, loomed on the horizon, a constant, painful reminder of all she had lost. It had been 6 months since the gate to the ranch, the very one her great-grandfather had forged, had been metaphorically and literally slammed in her face. The for sale sign that now stood sentry at the end of the long driveway felt like a personal affront, a final twist of the knife from her older brother Dean. After their father, the formidable patriarch Garrison Thompson had succumbed to a sudden heart attack. Dean, with the cold efficiency of a corporate raider, had produced a will that left everything to him. Cass, the daughter who had worked the land alongside her father, since she could walk, the one who understood the rhythm of the seasons and the language of the horses, was left with nothing but her father's old saddle and a cloud of suspicion. The town, ever hungry for a scandal, devoured the story. Wild Castle. They called her a nickname that had once been a term of endearment, for her untamable spirit now spat with venom. Rumors fueled by Dean's carefully placed whispers painted her as a reckless, spendthrift daughter who had broken her father's heart. He claimed she'd been draining the ranch's finances for years, a fabrication so blatant it was laughable. Yet the townsfolk, many of whom owed their livelihoods to the T-Cross, chose the path of least resistance. They sided with the man who now signed their paychecks. So Cass became a ghost haunting the periphery of her own life. She took refuge in the stables of a small independent rancher, a kind old man named Jedediah, who saw the truth in her haunted eyes and offered her a place to sleep in exchange for her unparalleled skill with horses. The stable was her sanctuary, the scent of hay and leather her only comfort. At night she'd lay on a cot, the moonlight streaming through the gaps in the weathered wood, listening to the soft sounds of the animals, their gentle presence a balm to her fractured heart. It was a lonely existence, a far cry from the life she had envisioned, a life filled with the laughter of her own children, running through the fields of the T-Cross. One particularly frigid evening, a storm rolled in from the mountains, the wind howling like a banshee rattling the stable doors. The temperature plummeted, and Cass, wrapped in every blanket she owned, shivered uncontrollably. The cold seeped into her bones, a gnawing ache that mirrored the emptiness in her chest. She had been so focused on survival, on simply getting through each day, that she hadn't allowed herself to feel the full weight of her grief and betrayal. But tonight, in the face of the storm's fury, the dam of her resilience began to crack. Suddenly the stable door creaked open, a sliver of light cutting through the darkness. Cass sat up, her heart pounding her hand instinctively reaching for the tire iron she kept by her cot. A tall, imposing figure stood silhouetted against the swirling snow. For a moment, she thought it was Dean, come to inflict some new cruelty. But as the figure stepped inside, shaking the snow from his broad shoulders, she recognized the stoic, readable face of Sheriff Brody. Sheriff Rhett. Brody was a man as weathered and unforgiving as the Montana landscape. A former Marine, he had returned to Redemption Peak a decade earlier, his face a mask of stone, his eyes holding a permanent storm of their own. He was a man of few words and even fewer smiles, a stark contrast to the town's usually gossipy, backslapping lawman. He did his job with a quiet, relentless efficiency that unnerved some and reassured others. Brody was a man who kept his distance, a solitary figure who seemed to carry the weight of the world on his shoulders. The townsfolk knew he had a past, a tragedy that had shaped him, but no one dared to ask. "Thompson," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the frigid air. He didn't use her first name. No one in an official capacity did anymore. "Sheriff," Cass replied, her voice hoarse, her body still trembling from the cold. She clutched the rough wool blanket tighter around her. "What do you want?" Brody's gaze swept over her meager living quarters. The lumpy cot, the worn saddle perched on a barrel, the stack of books she'd salvaged from the ranch house library. His eyes, the color of a winter sky, lingered on her chattering teeth. He didn't answer her question directly. Instead, he said, "Jedediah's worried about you. The temperature's supposed to drop another 10 degrees. This stable isn't fit for a human." Cass bristled at the implied pity. "I'm fine." She lied, her pride a stubborn, foolish thing. Brody just stared at her, his expression unreadable. He was a man who saw through lies for a living. "Gather your things," he said, not a request, but a command. "And go where?" She shot back, a spark of her old fire igniting in her eyes. "Last I checked, every door in this town is closed to me." "My door isn't," he said, his words hanging in the air, as unexpected as a summer snow. "You can have my bed. I'll take the couch." Cass was so stunned she couldn't speak. Sheriff Brody, the coldest, most emotionally distant man in Redemption Peak, was offering her his bed. It was an act of kindness, so out of character, so utterly baffling that she could only stare at him, her mind reeling. Why? What could he possibly want from her? She had nothing to offer him, no way to repay such a debt. As she hesitated, a particularly vicious gust of wind slammed against the stable, and a shiver racked her body so violently that her teeth chattered audibly. Brody's jaw tightened. "I'm not asking, Thompson," he said, his voice softer now, but with an undercurrent of steel that left no room for argument. "Let's go." Defeated by the cold and her own bewilderment, Cass slowly, reluctantly began to gather her few belongings. As she followed the sheriff out into the raging storm, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was trading one kind of danger for another. The stable was cold and lonely, but it was a predictable kind of misery. Sheriff Brody, with his haunted eyes and his unexpected act of charity, was a mystery, a puzzle she wasn't sure she was equipped to solve. And as the door to his warm, quiet house closed behind them, shutting out the storm, Cass had a premonition that the real storm was just beginning. Sheriff Brody's house was as Spartan and disciplined as the man himself. Located at the edge of town, it was a small, unassuming bungalow, neat to the point of being sterile. There were no family photos on the mantelpiece, no clutter on the coffee table, just a few books on local history and a single framed photograph of a woman with a radiant smile and eyes that danced with a light that had long since been extinguished in Brody's. He led Cass to a small guest room at the back of the house. The bed was neatly made, the quilt a simple handmade design. It was a stark contrast to the opulent custom-made furniture of the T-Cross, yet it felt more like a home than the ranch house ever had. "The bathroom is across the hall," Brody said, his voice still gruff, as if he were uncomfortable with his own act of kindness. "There are clean towels in the closet." He paused at the door, his hand on the knob. "Don't touch the photograph in the living room," he added, his voice low and tight, a muscle in his jaw twitching. Then he was gone, leaving Cass alone in the quiet warmth of the room. The hot shower was a luxury she hadn't realized how much she'd missed. As the steaming water washed away the grime and the chill of the stable, it also seemed to melt some of the icy armor she had built around her heart. For the first time in months, she allowed herself to feel the full crushing weight of her exhaustion. She had been running on pure adrenaline, fueled by anger and a desperate need to survive. Now, in the unexpected safety of the sheriff's house, the adrenaline ebbed away, leaving a hollow ache in its place. Wrapped in a thick, fluffy towel that smelled of cedar and something faintly masculine, she padded back to the guest room. She caught a glimpse of Brody in the living room, staring into the fireplace, his back to her. The photograph he had warned her about sat on the mantel, its silver frame glinting in the firelight. The woman in the picture was beautiful, her joy almost palpable. Cass wondered who she was, what had happened to her, and what secrets the stoic sheriff kept locked behind his stony facade. She slept more soundly that night than she had in months, the comfortable bed a world away from her lumpy cot in the stable. But her sleep was not dreamless. She dreamt of her father, of his booming laugh and the calloused hands that had taught her how to ride. She dreamt of the T-Cross, of galloping across the open fields with the wind in her hair. And then the dream soured. Her brother Dean was there, his face twisted in a sneer, the for sale sign in his hand, its stark red letters screaming at her. She woke with a gasp, her heart pounding, the ghost of the nightmare clinging to her like a shroud. The next morning, the smell of coffee and frying bacon wafted through the house. Cass dressed quickly, in her clean, albeit worn jeans and a flannel shirt, and followed the aroma to the kitchen. Brody was at the stove, a faded apron tied around his waist, a sight so incongruous with his tough-as-nails persona that Cass almost smiled. He gestured with a spatula towards the table, where a plate piled high with bacon, eggs, and toast awaited her. "Eat," he said, his voice still gruff, but there was a flicker of something in his eyes, something that might have been concern. As she ate, a comfortable silence settled between them, broken only by the clinking of cutlery. It was the first real meal she'd had in a long time, and she savored every bite. When she was finished, she looked up to find Brody watching her, his expression unreadable as ever. "Why are you doing this, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice quiet. "Why are you helping me?" Brody took a long sip of his coffee before answering. "Jedediah is a good man," he said, deflecting the question. "He's worried about you, and I don't like to see people in my town suffering, especially when they're being taken advantage of." The last part of his sentence hung in the air, and Cass's head snapped up. "What do you mean, taken advantage of?" Brody leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing slightly. "I've been looking into your father's will," he said, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial tone. "The lawyer who drafted it, a man named Marcus Thorne from Billings, has a less than stellar reputation. He's known for creative interpretations of the law, especially when there's a lot of money involved." Cass's heart began to beat a little faster. She had always harbored a sliver of doubt about the will, a nagging feeling that something wasn't right. Her father had always told her the T-Cross would be hers one day. He had promised. "What are you saying?" she whispered. "I'm saying," Brody said, his gaze locking with hers, "that I don't think your father's will is as ironclad as your brother would like everyone to believe. I think there's a good chance it was forged." The word hung in the air between them, a bombshell that shattered the fragile peace of the morning. Forged. The idea was so audacious, so diabolical, that for a moment Cass couldn't even process it. But as the initial shock wore off, a white-hot rage began to build in her chest. Dean. It had to be Dean. He had always been jealous of her bond with their father, of her natural talent with the land. But to forge their father's will, to steal her birthright, it was a betrayal of a magnitude she could barely comprehend. "Can you prove it?" she asked, her voice trembling with a mixture of hope and fury. "I'm working on it," Brody said. "I've sent a copy of the will to a handwriting expert in Helena, and I'm looking into Thorne's finances. A man like that doesn't get his hands dirty for free." He paused, his expression serious. "But I need your help, Cass." It was the first time he had used her first name, and the sound of it on his lips sent a strange shiver down her spine. "Anything," she said, her voice filled with a newfound determination. "Whatever you need. Tell me about your father," Brody said, his voice softening. "Tell me everything you remember about the days leading up to his death. Any conversations you had, anything that seemed out of the ordinary." And so Cass began to talk. She told him about her father's failing health, about the arguments he'd had with Dean over the future of the ranch. She told him about the mysterious phone calls her father had been receiving, calls that always seemed to leave him agitated and withdrawn. As she spoke, the pieces of the puzzle began to come together, forming a picture that was far more sinister than she could have ever imagined. The conversation was interrupted by a knock at the door. Brody's body tensed, his hand instinctively moving toward the gun on his hip. He peered through the peephole, his expression hardening. "It's your brother," he said, his voice a low growl. Cass's blood ran cold. "Dean. Here. What could he possibly want?" Brody opened the door, his large frame blocking the entrance. Dean stood on the porch, his handsome face marred by a smug, self-satisfied smirk. He was dressed in an expensive suit that looked out of place in the rustic town, a stark contrast to Brody's simple, functional attire. "Sheriff," Dean said, his voice dripping with false cordiality, "I was just coming to see if you'd found my sister. I was so worried when I heard she'd run off." He craned his neck, trying to see past Brody into the house. "Is she here?" "She's here," Brody said, his voice flat, his eyes like chips of ice. "And she's not going anywhere." Dean's smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by a flicker of surprise. He hadn't expected to find Cass with the sheriff. "Well, that's a relief," he said, recovering quickly. "I've just come to offer her a place to stay. The ranch house is her home after all. I don't know why she insists on this dramatic display of self-pity." "She's not the one being dramatic, Dean," Cass said, her voice shaking with rage as she stepped into the doorway, her eyes blazing. "And I'd rather sleep in a ditch than under the same roof as a liar and a thief." Dean's face darkened, the mask of concern slipping to reveal the ugliness beneath. "You'd be wise to watch your mouth, little sister," he hissed, his voice low and menacing. "You're in no position to be making accusations. And you're in no position to be making threats." Brody interjected, his voice a quiet warning. He took a step forward, his presence alone enough to make Dean take a step back. "I think it's time for you to leave." Dean's eyes darted between Cass and the sheriff, a look of calculation in their depths. He seemed to realize he was outmatched, at least for now. He forced a tight, unpleasant smile. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "But this isn't over. Not by a long shot." As Dean turned and stalked away, his expensive shoes crunching on the gravel driveway, Cass couldn't shake the feeling that she had just declared war, and she knew with a chilling certainty that her brother was a man who would stop at nothing to win. The sanctuary of the sheriff's house suddenly felt less like a fortress and more like the calm before a storm that threatened to tear not only her family apart, but the entire town of Redemption Peak. The confrontation with Dean left a bitter taste in Cass's mouth, but it also ignited a fire within her. For the first time since her father's death, she felt a flicker of hope, a sense that she wasn't just a victim of circumstance, but a fighter with a chance to reclaim her life. The unlikely alliance with Sheriff Brody, a man she had once viewed as an unfeeling automaton, had become her lifeline. In the days that followed, Brody's small bungalow became their war room. Cass, with her intimate knowledge of the T-Cross and her father's life, provided the context, the memories, the emotional landscape of the past. Brody, with his sharp analytical mind and his access to law enforcement resources, began to piece together the evidence. He was relentless, a quiet force of nature, and Cass found herself increasingly drawn to his unwavering sense of justice. She learned more about him in those few days than she had in the 10 years he'd been in Redemption Peak. She learned that he drank his coffee black, that he had a surprising fondness for old westerns, and that the woman in the photograph was his late wife Amelia. He spoke of her only once in a rare moment of vulnerability, his voice thick with a grief that was still raw, even after all these years. "She was a teacher," he'd said, his eyes fixed on the flickering flames in the fireplace. "She saw the good in everyone, even when they couldn't see it in themselves." Cass realized then that Brody's coldness wasn't a product of indifference, but of a profound, all-consuming loss. He had built a wall around his heart, not to keep others out, but to keep the pain in. And as she watched him work, his brow furrowed in concentration, his jaw set with a fierce determination to uncover the truth about her father's will. She saw a glimmer of the man Amelia must have loved, the man who saw the good in a wild, outcast cowgirl when no one else would. Their investigation led them down a rabbit hole of secrets and lies. Cass remembered a locked drawer in her father's desk, a drawer he had always been fiercely protective of. He called it his rainy day drawer, she told Brody. He said it was for emergencies. She had never known what was inside. The next night, under the cloak of darkness, they drove to the T-Cross. The ranch house, once a symbol of warmth and family, now stood dark and silent, a monument to Dean's greed. As Brody, with his lock-picking skills honed in the military, worked on the back door, Cass felt a pang of guilt. She was breaking into her own home, but the guilt was quickly replaced by a surge of righteous anger. This was her home, and she would fight for it. Inside, the house felt cold and unfamiliar. Dean had already begun to make changes, replacing their mother's beloved antique furniture with sleek, modern pieces that were as soulless as he was. They made their way to their father's study, the one room that seemed to have been left untouched. The air was thick with the scent of old books and leather, a smell that brought a lump to Cass's throat. Brody made quick work of the lock on the desk drawer. Inside, nestled beneath a stack of old stock certificates, was a small leather-bound journal. Cass's heart leaped. She recognized her father's elegant looping handwriting on the first page. It was his private journal, a place where he had recorded his thoughts, his fears, his hopes for the future. They took the journal back to Brody's house, and with a growing sense of trepidation, began to read. The entries painted a harrowing picture of her father's final months. He wrote of his declining health, his fear of leaving Cass alone, and his growing distrust of Dean. He described Dean's increasingly aggressive attempts to take control of the ranch, his get-rich-quick schemes that had nearly bankrupted them a decade earlier. And then they found it, an entry dated just 2 weeks before his death. "Dean brought a man to the house today," her father had written. "A lawyer from Billings named Thorne. They wanted me to sign some papers, a new will. They said it was just a formality, a way to protect the ranch from estate taxes. But the look in Dean's eyes, it was the look of a vulture circling its prey. I told them, no, I told them the T-Cross would go to Cass, as I always promised. Dean was furious. He said I was a sentimental old fool, that Cass would run the ranch into the ground. The things he said about her, about my own daughter. It broke my heart." Cass's hands were shaking as she read the words. It was all there in black and white. Her father's fear. Dean's treachery, the name of the corrupt lawyer. But it was the next part of the entry that made her blood run cold. "I have a secret," her father had written. "A ghost from the past that I have never spoken of to anyone. A secret that could destroy us all if it ever came to light. I have hidden the proof in the one place no one would ever think to look. The place where my own father and his father before him kept their most treasured possessions. The heart of the T-Cross." The heart of the T-Cross? Cass whispered, her mind racing. What could he have meant? What secret was so terrible it could destroy them all? And where was this hiding place? Brody, his face grim, closed the journal. "This is it, Cass," he said, his voice low and intense. "This is the proof we need. But we also need to find whatever it is your father hid. It could be the key to everything." Their search for the heart of the T-Cross became an obsession. They scoured old maps of the ranch, pored over family photo albums, and interviewed former ranch hands, anyone who might have a clue as to what her father had meant. But the hiding place remained a mystery. Meanwhile, Dean was not idle. He seemed to sense that the tide was turning against him. He began to apply pressure, using his influence in the town to make Cass's life even more miserable. He had Jedediah's lease on his small ranch terminated, forcing the old man to move his livestock and leaving Cass with nowhere to go but Brody's house. He spread more vicious rumors, painting her as a home wrecker who was shacking up with the sheriff. The whispers and the sideways glances followed her everywhere she went, a constant reminder of her pariah status. One evening, as Cass was walking back to Brody's house from the general store, a truck pulled up beside her, its engine rumbling menacingly. The window rolled down, and a man she recognized as one of Dean's ranch hands leaned out. "Your brother sends his regards," the man sneered, his eyes filled with a cruel amusement. "He says you should stop digging around in things that don't concern you, or you might get hurt." The threat was not subtle. Cass's heart pounded in her chest, but she refused to let him see her fear. She lifted her chin, her eyes flashing with defiance. "You can tell my brother," she said, her voice steady, "that I'm not afraid of him, and I'm not backing down." The man laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You're a feisty one, ain't you?" he said. "Just like your mother." The casual, almost dismissive mention of her mother, who had died in a riding accident when Cass was just a child, sent a chill down her spine. The circumstances of her mother's death had always been shrouded in a fog of unanswered questions. her father too grief-stricken to ever speak of it in detail. Could her mother's death be connected to the secret her father had written about in his journal? As the truck sped away, leaving her in a cloud of dust and exhaust fumes, Cass felt a growing sense of dread. The ghost of the T-Cross was not just a metaphor. It was real, a tangible presence that had haunted her family for generations, and she was beginning to suspect that unearthing that ghost might be more dangerous than she could ever have imagined. The search for her birthright had become a search for a much darker truth, a truth that had the power to not only clear her name, but to shatter the very foundations of her family's legacy. The ranch hand's veiled threat and his chilling mention of her mother sent Cass reeling. The mystery of her family's past deepened the tendrils of deceit and secrecy, reaching further back than she had ever imagined. The heart of the T-Cross was no longer just a hiding place for a legal document. It was the epicenter of a multi-generational earthquake, and she and Brody were standing directly on the fault line. They intensified their search, driven by a new sense of urgency. The phrase, "just like your mother," echoed in Cass's mind. She racked her brain, trying to remember conversations, snippets of stories, anything about her mother, Evelyn Thompson. She had been a vibrant, spirited woman, a skilled horsewoman from a neighboring county. Her death had been ruled a tragic accident. Her horse, spooked by a rattlesnake, had thrown her against a rocky outcrop. But now, seen through the lens of suspicion, the accident felt less like a random act of fate and more like a carefully constructed lie. "Tell me about the day your mother died," Brody said one evening, his voice gentle. They were sitting in his living room, the fire casting long shadows on the walls. The photograph of Amelia seemed to watch them, her, a silent witness to their unfolding drama. Cass closed her eyes, dredging up the painful memories. "I was only 6, she whispered. "I remember the chaos, the shouting. My father, I'd never seen him like that. He was broken." She remembered fragments of conversations, hushed words not meant for her young ears. "I remember someone saying she was reckless, that she took too many chances. The same things they say about me now." A thought struck her, a sudden chilling connection. My father sold her favorite horse, a beautiful Palomino named Sundance, right after the accident. He never said why. He just got rid of it. And he never spoke of her again. Brody's eyes narrowed. "That's strange," he said. "A man who loved his wife as much as you say your father did. Why would he erase her memory like that?" The question hung in the air, heavy and unanswered. They were missing a piece of the puzzle, a crucial link that would connect the past to the present. The answer they both knew lay somewhere on the vast, sprawling expanse of the T-Cross. Their break came from an unexpected source. Jedediah, the displaced old rancher, came to see them, his face etched with worry. "I don't know if this means anything," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But I was talking to my cousin Martha, the one who used to be the housekeeper at the T-Cross, back when your folks first got married. She said your mother Evelyn used to spend hours in the old root cellar. Said it was her thinking spot. She even had a special key made for it, different from the one that opened the main house." A root cellar. Cass's heart pounded. She remembered the old root cellar, a stone-lined pit built into the side of a hill not far from the main house. It had been sealed up years ago after a partial collapse. Her father had always said it was too dangerous to go near. "The heart of Vesulati Cross." She breathed the words, tasting of dust and discovery. It was a place of preservation, a place where things were kept safe from the ravages of time. It was the perfect hiding place. The next night, armed with shovels and lanterns, They returned to the T-cross. The root cellar was exactly as Cass remembered it, its heavy wooden doors warped and weathered, half buried in dirt and overgrown with weeds. It took them the better part of an hour to clear the entrance and pry open the stubborn doors. A gust of cool, musty air rushed out to greet them, the smell of damp earth and forgotten memories. Inside the cellar was larger than Cass had remembered. Cobwebs hung from the low ceiling like tattered lace, and the stone walls were slick with moisture. In the center of the room, almost completely obscured by a pile of rotted wooden crates, was a small, locked chest. It was old, banded with iron, and it bore a single, elegant E carved into the lid. Evelyn's chest. Brody, ever prepared, produced a set of tools. The lock was old and rusted, but after a few tense moments of probing and twisting, it sprang open with a satisfying click. Cass held her breath as she lifted the heavy lid. Inside, resting on a bed of faded velvet, was not a legal document, but a collection of letters tied together with a faded silk ribbon. The handwriting was her mother's, the ink slightly faded but still legible. There was also a small, tarnished silver locket. Cass opened it. Inside were 2 tiny, faded photographs. One was of her mother, radiant and smiling. The other was of a man Cass had never seen before, a handsome, dark-haired man with kind eyes. With trembling hands, Cass began to read the letters. They were love letters, filled with passion and longing, but they were not addressed to her father. They were addressed to a man named Thomas. The story that unfolded in those letters was a bombshell that rocked Cass to her core. Her mother, Evelyn, had been in love with another man, a ranch hand named Thomas Riley, who had worked on her family's ranch. They had planned to run away together, but her parents, who disapproved of the match, had forced her to marry Garrison Thompson, a man of wealth and status. The marriage had been a prison for Evelyn, a gilded cage from which she had desperately sought escape. The letters revealed that Evelyn had continued her affair with Thomas, even after she was married. They would meet in secret, their love a dangerous, forbidden flame. And then the most devastating revelation of all. A letter dated just a few months before Cass's birth. "My dearest Thomas," Evelyn had written, "I have news, wonderful and terrifying news. I am with child. Garrison believes the baby is his, but we both know the truth. This child, our child, is a testament to our love, a love that no one can ever take from us." Cass felt the air leave her lungs. The words on the page swam before her eyes. She was not Garrison Thompson's daughter. She was the daughter of a ranch hand, the product of a secret, forbidden love. The wildness that her father, the man she had called her father, had both cherished and feared in her, was not his legacy. It was her mother's and her true father's. Suddenly, everything made sense. Her father's, Garrison's, complicated relationship with her, the mixture of love and resentment she had always felt from him, Dean's visceral hatred of her, his constant accusations that she wasn't a real Thompson. It wasn't just about the ranch, it was about her very identity. And then the final horrifying piece of the puzzle fell into place. The last letter in the bundle was not from her mother. It was from Thomas, and it was dated the day after her mother's death. It was a letter of pure, unadulterated anguish. "My love, my Evelyn," he had written. He found out. Garrison found out about us. He confronted me today, his eyes filled with a rage I have never seen. He knows Cass is not his. He said he would not be made a fool of. He said he would take care of it. I fear for my life, my love, but more than that, I fear for our daughter. Keep her safe. Tell her the truth when she is old enough to understand. Tell her that her father loved her more than life itself. The letter ended there, abruptly. Cass looked at Brody, her face ashen, her eyes wide with a dawning horror. "He killed them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Garrison killed them both, my mother and my father. The riding accident was no accident. It was murder. And Thomas Riley, he had simply disappeared." Brody's face was a mask of cold, hard fury. He had seen the darkness in men's souls before. But this was a level of cruelty that still had the power to shock him. He reached out and placed a hand on Cass's arm, his touch a steady, grounding presence in the swirling chaos of her emotions. "We have to go to the authorities," Cass said, her voice gaining strength, fueled by a new righteous anger. "We have to tell them everything." "No," Brody said, his voice firm. "Not yet." He looked at her, his eyes filled with a grim understanding. "Garrison is dead, but Dean is not, and he knows this secret. The journal. Your father wrote that he had a secret that could destroy them all. This is it. And Dean is using it to control you, to blackmail you into giving up the ranch. If we go to the police now, he'll twist the story. He'll paint your mother as an adulteress, you as an illegitimate child with no claim to the Thompson name or the T-Cross. He'll use the town's prejudice against you. We need more than just these letters. We need irrefutable proof of the murders. We need to find out what happened to Thomas Riley." Cass knew he was right. The letters were a personal revelation, a cataclysm that had shattered her sense of self. But in the eyes of the law, they were just the words of a long-dead woman. To bring Dean down, to truly reclaim her birthright, she needed to find justice for the parents she had never known. The fight for the T-Cross had become a fight for their memory, a fight to expose a truth that had been buried for a quarter of a century. And as they emerged from the darkness of the root cellar into the cold Montana night, Cass knew that she was no longer just fighting for a piece of land. She was fighting for her very soul. The discovery in the root cellar changed everything. The fight was no longer about a forged will. It was about murder. The weight of this new reality settled heavily on Cass and Brody, binding them together in a grim alliance. The quiet sanctuary of the sheriff's home became a fortress, a place to strategize against an enemy who was not just a greedy brother, but the heir to a legacy of violence and deceit. "Thomas Riley," Brody said, the name now etched into their investigation. "If we can find out what happened to him, we can connect Garrison to his disappearance, and by extension to Evelyn's murder." Their search for Thomas Riley began in the dusty archives of the county courthouse. They found his birth certificate, his employment records from the ranch where he had worked before meeting Evelyn. But then the trail went cold. He had simply vanished 25 years ago, a ghost who had left behind only a handful of letters and a daughter who never knew his name. Brody, using his official capacity as sheriff, began to make discreet inquiries. He contacted law enforcement agencies in neighboring states, sent out feelers to old colleagues, but the name Thomas Riley yielded nothing. It was as if the man had ceased to exist. Meanwhile, Dean, sensing their renewed determination, escalated his campaign of intimidation. The threats were no longer veiled. One morning, Brody found the tires of his patrol car slashed. Another day, a dead rattlesnake was left on his doorstep, a clear and chilling message. The town, caught in the crossfire, became a tinderbox of gossip and suspicion. The battle for the T-Cross had become a public spectacle, and Cass and Brody were at the center of the storm. Cass, however, was no longer the timid, shivering girl Brody had found in the stable. The knowledge of her true parentage, while devastating, had also given her a new sense of purpose. She was not just fighting for a ranch. She was fighting for the honor of the mother she barely remembered and the father she had never met. The wildness that had once been a source of shame was now a source of strength, a legacy of a love that had defied convention and paid the ultimate price. Their breakthrough came once again from the past. Brody poring over old case files from his predecessor, a man known for his lazy, indifferent approach to law enforcement, stumbled upon a John Doe case from 25 years ago. A body had been found in a remote ravine at the edge of the T-Cross property, the victim of a single gunshot wound to the back of the head. The body had never been identified, and the case had quickly gone cold. "The date," Brody said, his voice tight with a mixture of excitement and dread. "The body was found a week after your mother's death." They drove to the county medical examiner's office, a sterile, impersonal building that smelled of disinfectant. Brody, using his badge and his considerable powers of persuasion, convinced the crusty old medical examiner to pull the file. The report was brief, the details sparse. But there was one thing that made Cass's breath catch in her throat, a black and white photograph of the victim's personal effects. Among them was a small, tarnished silver locket. It was identical to the one she had found in her mother's chest. With trembling hands, she took the locket from her pocket and placed it on the table next to the photograph. They were a perfect match. "It's him," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "It's my father." The medical examiner, a man who had seen more than his share of tragedy, looked from the locket to Cass's face, his expression softening. "We still have the skeletal remains in storage," he said, his voice gentle. "We can do a DNA comparison." The wait for the DNA results was agonizing. For 2 weeks, Cass and Brody lived in a state of suspended animation, the fate of their investigation hanging in the balance. During that time, the bond between them deepened. They were no longer just allies. They were partners, confidants, two lonely souls who had found in each other a solace they had not realized they were missing. One evening, as they sat by the fire, the unspoken tension between them finally broke. "Rhett," Cass said, using his first name for the first time. "Why are you doing all of this? I know it's not just about Jedediah or about your sense of duty. Why are you risking so much for me?" Brody was silent for a long time, his eyes fixed on the flames. When he finally spoke, his voice was raw with a pain that was still fresh even after all these years. "When Amelia died," he said, his voice barely a whisper, "the man who hit her was drunk. He was a powerful man in this town with friends in high places. They covered it up. They called it an accident. I couldn't prove it, but I knew. I knew he had gotten away with murder." He turned to look at her, his eyes filled with a fierce, protective light. "I couldn't get justice for Amelia," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But I can get it for you." In that moment, Cass saw past the stoic sheriff, past the grief-stricken widower, and saw the man he truly was, a man of deep integrity, a man who believed in justice with every fiber of his being, and she realized with a sudden, startling clarity that she was falling in love with him. The call from the medical examiner's office came on a Tuesday morning. The DNA was a match. The John Doe was without a doubt Thomas Riley. They finally had their proof. Brody moved quickly. He obtained a warrant for Dean's arrest, not for forgery, but for accessory to murder. The charge was a gamble, based on the assumption that Dean knew the truth about his father's crimes and had used that knowledge to blackmail Cass. They found Dean at the T-Cross in the process of showing the property to a potential buyer. When he saw Brody and his deputies approaching, his face paled. The smug, arrogant mask fell away, revealing the coward beneath. "Dean Thompson," Brody said, his voice ringing with authority. "You're under arrest for accessory to the murder of Thomas Riley." Dean laughed, a high, hysterical sound. "You're insane," he spat. "You have no proof." "We have the letters," Cass said, her voice clear and strong as she stepped forward. "We have the locket, and we have a body. Your father's secret is out, Dean. It's over." The fight went out of him then. His shoulders slumped, and he allowed the deputies to lead him away, a broken man whose empire of lies had crumbled around him. The arrest sent shockwaves through Redemption Peak. The story of the star-crossed lovers, the brutal murders, and the decades-long cover-up was all anyone could talk about. The town, which had once shunned Cass, now looked at her with a mixture of pity and awe. She was no longer wild Cass, the outcast. She was the woman who had brought down the most powerful family in the county, the woman who had unearthed a truth that had been buried for a quarter of a century. But the fight was not over. Dean, facing a lifetime in prison, was not going to go down without a fight. He hired the best lawyer money could buy, a slick, ruthless attorney from the city who was known for his courtroom theatrics and his ability to turn black into white. The stage was set for a trial that would not only decide Dean's fate, but would also lay bare the soul of Redemption Peak, forcing its citizens to confront the dark secrets they had allowed to fester in their midst for far too long. The reckoning had begun, and Cass and Brody knew that the hardest part of their journey was still to come. The trial of Dean Thompson cleaved Redemption Peak in two. The small courthouse became the town's stage where a legacy of deceit was laid bare for all to see. Dean's high-priced lawyer, Sterling Vance, was a master of manipulation, painting a picture of a loyal son, protecting his family from a wild, illegitimate half-sister. He twisted Cass's past, her spirit, her very existence into weapons against her, portraying her mother as a shameless adulteress, and Cass as a cuckoo in the nest. When Cass took the stand, Vance's attacks were relentless, but the woman who faced him was not the same one who had shivered in a stable. The knowledge of her true parentage had forged her grief into a shield of resolve. "My brother isn't the victim here," Cass stated, her voice clear and strong, silencing the courtroom whispers. "The victims are the mother I barely knew and the father I never met. This ranch was built on their love, and it was stolen through violence and lies." She spoke with a raw honesty that was more powerful than any legal maneuvering. Sheriff Rhett Brody's testimony was the anchor of fact in a sea of innuendo. He calmly presented the grim timeline, the discovery of Thomas Riley's remains, and the irrefutable DNA match. He was an immovable force of truth against Vance's storm of accusations. The tide began to turn with the testimony of Martha, the elderly former housekeeper. Frail but resolute, she recounted the terrible argument she overheard between Garrison and Evelyn on the day of the accident. "He knew about the affair," she said, her voice trembling but firm. "He was waving a letter, his face full of rage. Later I saw him with his hunting rifle. He said he was going after a coyote, but the look in his eyes wasn't for any animal." Vance's attempts to discredit the old woman as senile and vengeful backfired, making him look like a bully. But the final devastating blow came from Garrison Thompson himself, a voice from beyond the grave. Buried deep within the rainy day drawer overlooked in the initial search was a second, smaller journal. It was Garrison's confession. The prosecutor read the chilling words aloud. Garrison detailed the murders of his wife and her lover in a script filled with self-loathing and rage. The final entry sealed his son's fate. "I have told Dean everything. The burden of my sins is now his to bear." A collective gasp swept the room. Dean's face collapsed, the arrogant smirk vanishing, replaced by the stark terror of a man whose final card had just been played against him. He had known all along. He hadn't just forged a will. He had actively concealed a double homicide, using the horrific secret as leverage to steal his sister's birthright. The jury needed less than an hour. The verdict was guilty on all counts. As a stunned Dean was sentenced to 20 years and led away in handcuffs, his eyes locked with Cass's. They held no remorse, only a cold, venomous hatred that promised the fight was not truly over. The trial had ended, and justice had been served, but Cass stood alone in the wreckage of her family, knowing that rebuilding her life on the tainted ground of the T-Cross would be the hardest fight of all. The verdict brought justice, but not peace. The sprawling T-Cross ranch, now hers, felt less like a prize and more like a monument to tragedy. Every silent room echoed with the ghosts of the family. She had lost the mother she never knew, the father who was a stranger, the brother who was a monster, and the complicated man who had raised her. The weight of their secrets was embedded in the very soil, with Rhett as her steadfast partner, a quiet anchor in the storm of her past. Cass knew she could not build a future on a foundation of pain. She needed to forge a new legacy. Her first act was to tear down the iconic T-Cross gate. In its place, she raised a new sign, its carved letters spelling out a story of forgiveness and hope, the Riley Thompson Ranch. It was a tribute to all her parents, to the forbidden love that gave her life, and to the flawed man who, in his own way, had shaped her. This single act began the slow process of healing. Cass and Rhett worked the land together, their shared purpose chasing the darkest shadows away. The ranch slowly came back to life, not as a symbol of a fallen dynasty, but as a testament to the resilience of a woman who had refused to be broken. A portion of the estate was used to fund a community trust in Amelia Brody's name, turning a legacy of pain into one of hope for the entire town. The outcast cowgirl, who once slept in a stable, was now the master of her own destiny. She had found her home not in the acreage or the house, but in the love of the sheriff who had seen her worth and in the strength she had discovered within herself. The story of Cass and Rhett is a powerful reminder that our pasts do not have to define our futures. It's a story about the courage it takes to confront painful truths, the resilience of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable betrayal, and the healing power of a love that arrives when you least expect it. From the cold floor of a stable to the warmth of a shared home, their journey shows us that even in the dust of despair, new beginnings can take root. It proves that justice, however long delayed, can prevail, and that a legacy is not just what we inherit, but what we choose to build. If this story of love, loss, and redemption moved you, please give this video a thumbs up and share it with someone who appreciates a story with real heart. Don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you don't miss our next real-life drama. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. What part of Cass's journey resonated with you the most?